It's an honor and a privilege to be speaking to Padmashri Y H Malegam, a doyen of Indian auditing profession, in preparation for our event in the World Congress of Accountants 2022. Thank you, Mr. Malegam. Thank you for your time. It's a pleasure speaking to you today. Mr. Malegam, I'll start the discussion straight away by pointing out that there is concern in the auditing fraternity about the regulatory sort of overreach, not an outreach, it's an overreach. And there's a concern that the profession is going through a lot of challenges because of the regulatory overreach. And how should the auditing profession prepare themselves for such a scenario?
I think there are two aspects of this. First is that the regulatory bodies at the moment are still in their early stage of operation. So there is fair amount of enthusiasm about this. So the regulatory bodies themselves have to realize that their role is to be an oversight body. And as an oversight body, they should strengthen the intermediaries over whom they carry out an oversight and not take over any of the functions. Because if they take over the functions, then there is no oversight on that function. But at the same time, the profession must welcome the existence of an oversight body, because it's only if there is someone else who monitors the quality of audit that the quality of audit will improve. Now, when you look at the quality of audit, you must consider that in the context of the public expectations. In the past, the public expectation of auditors was that they provided reliability on the financial statements. Now that concern still remains, but the investing public now is more relying upon the opinion of analysts, financial advisors, etc., and much less on their own reading of the financial statements. But there is a greater concern which is emerging. The failure of large corporations means that the investing public is concerned with the protection of their investment. And therefore, while the auditor still has to discharge a function of providing reliability, he has to concentrate more on the watchdog role of an auditor. Now, companies fail for a number of reasons. They might fail because of economic situations. They might fail because of intense competition. They might fail because of mismanagement. The auditor has a very little role to play in that connection. But they can also fail because of the exuberance of promoters, as a result of which the companies are financially stressed, or because of fraud. And it is in these areas that the auditors have a very important role to play. It is true that our current accounting standards require that the auditor should comment upon a going concern concept, and that the account should disclose the financial liabilities and the debt equity ratio. But I don't think that is enough. The going concern concept is today applied for a period of 12 months. I think we need to look at a much larger period. Like rating agencies, a very good tool would be the DSCR, that's the debt service coverage ratio. And that looks at a period of 3 to 5 years to say, if there are no change in circumstances, will the company be able to discharge its financial obligations? So that is one of the areas which the auditors have to look at. The second thing they have to consider is that it's not the finances of the company alone which will determine its financial ability to withstand adverse situations. It's the finances of the group as a whole. There is a domino effect. When one company in a group fails, it has an effect on every other company. So perhaps the auditors must also look at the total group picture, not necessarily in detail as far as other companies are concerned, but generally to see whether the group is overstressed or is financially sound and so on. Coming now to fraud, fraud can be looked at in two dimensions. You look at employee fraud and you look at management fraud. Our existing concern about the existence and operation of controls is perhaps adequate for the prevention and detection of employee fraud. But it may not be adequate for the prevention detection of management fraud, because management can override the controls. And therefore, you have to look at circumstances in which management fraud takes place. Now, management fraud can take place perhaps in a simple situation like bypassing regulations, or it can take place through the diversion of funds, or it can take place through misappropriation. Now, perhaps the most common situation in which fraud takes place is the diversion of funds. And therefore, auditors have to look at the possibility of diversion. In my opinion, they should look at the companies or entities which are trading partners of the company, to see what is the nature of their business, whether their business is consistent with the business of the company, particularly if they are foreign entities about whom we often not have adequate information. And then they should look at transactions which don't appear to be in the normal course of business. Now, taking all of this together, it means that audit quality is a very important consideration. And how do you ensure audit quality? One of the tools by which audit quality is ensured is by quality audit review. And there are some aspects of the quality audit review which we need to consider. One is, often board meetings to consider accounts are scheduled to suit the convenience of the board, and the auditor is asked to provide the audited accounts by that date. And this sometimes gives them inadequate time to do an adequate quality review. I think auditors should stand firm, and they should insist on adequate time for a proper audit quality review to be done. The second thing we have to consider is that initially, before digitalization, there was a lot of emphasis on arithmetical accuracy, and therefore you employed a large number of juniors to do the work. This situation has changed. Auditors don't have to do this amount of work, and therefore the need for junior staff has diminished and is replaced by a need for senior staff. Now, therefore, that change must take place, and the quality audit review must be done by very senior staff. The third thing is the impact of digitalization. Now, digitalization has given some very impressive tools to the auditors. For example, data analytics enables the auditor to look at the whole range of transactions instead of doing a test check. So its coverage is much greater. But I think auditors should be careful that they do not become prisoners of technology. You take the example of a doctor. When a doctor asks for tests to be done and examines the test, he doesn't rely only upon the test, he also does a clinical examination. Auditors must also look at it in that light. that whereas the analytical and digital tools will give them the ability to identify areas of concern, they must also ensure that they give adequate time to value judgments. And more auditors will be required to devote time to value judgments. There's another aspect of digital advance, which is that with digital technology, auditors tend to be physically removed from the place of audit. They do not interact sufficiently with the employees or the people who are preparing the accounts. And a very important tool, that their ability to assess the extent of reliance they can place upon individuals is therefore no longer available. Similarly, in the olden days, one used to use the ledger scrutiny as an important tool of audit. That is not done now, or it may not even be possible. So you have to adopt your techniques to ensure that while you rely upon digital methods, you supplement them with tools which are adequate for value. And finally, the question of independence. Independence does not consist merely in ensuring that you don't do prohibited work with the companies you audit. It must be looked at in a wider context. Whereas it is good to have good relationships with management, it's a mistake to try and solve management problems. And more importantly, at all times, auditors must develop a feeling of skepticism, not accept everything at face value. So I think these are the areas in which quality of audit will significantly improve.
Today, we don't have standards for small and less complex entities. We don't have separate standards. So your auditing standards appears as though it's one size fits all. And these smaller audits, trying to comply with these standards on auditing, effectively is becoming a failure because
correct,
nothing much happens.
That is what I was saying. If you think about the standards as a mandatory checklist, where every box has to be ticked off, then it creates a real problem for a small firm. If you look upon auditing standards as guidelines, as something to be applied in appropriate circumstances, then you are in a different ball game. And that is how I think a standard must be looked at. You first consider whether there is an aspect of a standard which is material to your organization. If it is not material to that company, then that standard need not be observed. And this is really the problem with the oversight bodies, with the regulators. The regulators must also put themselves in the position of the auditor, who has to do an audit within a particular time frame, within a particular resources available to him, and then see whether he needs to adhere to every single aspect of the standard, even when it gives no benefit. If you have to document everything, for example, a standard may say that you document every agreement which is there, which you've observed. Then the question is, how important is that agreement to that entity? If the agreement is not relevant, if the agreement is not material, why should you document it? And what is the cost of doing the audit, whether there is any benefit which flows out of that one? So both the auditors and the regulators have to adopt a much more pragmatic approach to standards, just a mechanical adherence to them.
So last question, sir.
Yeah.
There is a expectation that India may make joint audits mandatory for certain category of companies. If that were to be made operational or made into regulation, how should the smaller firms or the local firms in India prepare themselves to face that market? Because it will certainly give them an opportunity to be exposed to large audits, which they would have never ever performed. So how does there be a quantum step by the small firms to take up this opportunity?
The first issue, of course, is that I am not in favor, or sorry, put it the other way. I am all in favor, or I would certainly accept a proposition that there should be a joint audit. And the argument in favor of a joint audit is that there are two firms who are responsible, and therefore value judgments are seen by both firms. You know, for a long period of time, we have been, for example, Ferguson and ourselves were joint auditors of a large number of companies. We were able to work together. Now, I'm not in favor of a situation where the type of joint auditor is to be imposed upon a company. It is unfair to the company and it's unfair to the other auditor. When you have a joint auditor, you share the work with the joint auditor. You expect that that joint auditor has the same capabilities as you have. You expect that he will function with the same quality which you have. And therefore, you share the work. If you are asked to work with a joint auditor who doesn't have that capability, or who has the capability which you are not confident or are aware of, then you would end up doing the whole audit yourself. And then the other auditor would again do the same audit. So, I think before we impose such a situation, we should first come to the conclusion that the smaller firms must also acquire the competence to do the audit of a large company. This means they must have the organization, they must have the quality, they must have the investment which is needed for that purpose. And if the small firms remain small or independent, it's unlikely that they will be able to acquire all of this. Therefore, they also have to form part of a network. If those firms become part of a network, then the network as a whole can afford to have all the qualities which are needed, like investment, etc., training, etc., to create the competence whereby there is no reason why they cannot then be selected as a joint auditor.
Thank you, sir. This is a very, very, very useful guidances and
Yes,
information. We hope to inculcate almost all of what you have said in true and fair policies. I'm very, very confident about that. In fact, Kirti here will be able to endorse that, because as you have been speaking, I've been thinking of what all we have done in true and fair. I think everything we have done, other than the aspect of the talking audit report, where I may need to think through and modify a bit in terms of what my thinking has been. But your guidance has been very, very helpful. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.